I'm looking at the altimeter on my wrist. It's a Casio, solar-powered, scratched face. Cheap thing I bought at a hardware store in Portland 3 years ago. It says we are at 6,400 feet above sea level. Yesterday, the reading was steady. Today, it's fluctuating. Not because the mountain is moving, though it did move, God, did it move, but because the air pressure is all wrong. The air tastes like copper and rotten eggs. I'm looking out the window of the catwalk. 360 degrees of view. Used to be the best view in Washington state. Endless pines, the jagged teeth of the Cascades, the shimmering ribbon of the river down in the valley. Now, it's just white. Not clouds. Not fog. It's heavier than that. It looks like milk poured into a bowl. It's sitting there, perfectly flat, filling the valley floor. It's swallowed the access road. It's swallowed the ranger station at the trailhead. It's swallowed the town of Packwood, 10 miles out. I'm Elias Thorne. I'm the fire watch for Blackwood Ridge. And I think I might be the last man standing above the cloud line. Let's go back. I need to go back to the morning. I need to remember what normal felt like, because I have a feeling I'm going to forget it pretty soon. It was October 14th. Tuesday. The morning started the way it always does up here. The sun hits the east-facing windows of the tower around 5:45 a.m. It's not a gentle light. At this altitude, it's piercing. It warms up the glass of the cab, that's what we call the room, the 14 by 14 box I live in, and turns it into a greenhouse. I woke up before the alarm. I always do. The mattress on the cot is thin, just a slab of foam on a steel frame, but I've slept better on it than I ever did on the memory foam king-size back in Seattle. No traffic. No sirens. Just the wind buffeting the steel legs of the tower. I got up, put on my flannel, the red and black one with the fraying cuff, pulled on my boots. Didn't lace them yet. I shuffled over to the propane stove. The ritual is important. You live in a box in the sky for 4 months at a time. You live by your rituals. I struck the match. The smell of sulfur, then the whoosh of the blue flame. I set the percolator on the burner. The water was from the cistern, pumped up by hand yesterday. It has a metallic taste to it that you stop noticing after week 2. While the coffee percolated, I did the check. I grabbed the binoculars, Nikon Monarchs, issued by the Forest Service, and walked the perimeter of the catwalk inside the glass. North quadrant, clear, just deep green canopy. East quadrant, clear, sun coming up over the ridge, blinding and golden. South quadrant, clear. I could see the glint of a windshield way down on the logging road, probably a timber scout. West quadrant, clear. Station Blackwood to dispatch. Morning check over, I said into the radio. The handset is that heavy beige plastic that feels indestructible. There was a pause. Static. Then, lazy and bored, came Sandy's voice from the main station down in Randall. Morning, Blackwood. You're loud and clear. Temp is 42 degrees down here. Expecting a heater today. Over. Copy that, Sandy. Clear skies up top. Visibility is 20+ miles. Gonna be a boring one. Over. Boring is good, Elias. Boring pays the bills. Dispatch out. That was the last time I spoke to Sandy. The last time I spoke to anyone. I poured the coffee. It was black, thick, and hot enough to scald the roof of my mouth. I sat in the Osborne Firefinder, the big circular map table in the center of the room, and opened my book. A paperback Western. Lonesome Dove. I've read it 4 times. I was on page 312, where Gus is talking about the nature of life. I read for an hour. It was perfect. The silence was absolute, just the occasional creak of the tower settling in the wind and the sound of my own breathing. I remember looking at a dust mote floating in a shaft of sunlight. It was drifting, peaceful. Then the dust mote stopped drifting. It vibrated. It didn't start with a noise. It started with a feeling in my teeth, a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the steel legs of the tower, up through the floorboards, and into my skeleton. It felt like standing next to a massive subwoofer that was playing a note too low to hear. I put the coffee cup down. The liquid inside was rippling. Concentric circles, perfect and fast. Then the birds took flight. That's something they don't show you in the disaster movies. The birds go first. Thousands of them. I looked out the west window and saw a black cloud rising from the canopy below. Crows, starlings, jays, sparrows. They weren't flying in a formation. They were exploding upward, screaming. A chaotic, desperate ascent. "What the hell?" I whispered. Then the sound hit. It wasn't a rumble. It was a crack, like the spine of the world snapping. It was so loud my ears popped instantly. I stood up, and the floor dropped 6 inches. I fell hard, hitting my hip against the steel frame of the firefinder. The coffee cup launched off the table and shattered against the window. But the window didn't break. Not yet. The tower is designed to sway. It's on 60-foot steel legs anchored into the granite of the peak. It's meant to handle high winds, winter storms, maybe a mild tremor. It is not meant for an 8.9 magnitude slipstrike event. The shaking was violent. It wasn't a sway. It was a thrashing. I crawled under the heavy oak table of the firefinder, curling into a ball, covering my head. The sound was deafening. Metal screaming, bolts shearing, glass rattling in the frames like machine-gun fire. I looked out the window from my position on the floor. The horizon was tilting. I saw the sky, then the trees, then the sky again. The tower was whipping back and forth like a pendulum in a hurricane. Snap! One of the cross-bracing cables outside gave way. It sounded like a gunshot. The tension wire lashed against the side of the cab, cracking the reinforced glass of the north window. "Stop!" I yelled. "Just stop!" But it didn't stop. It went on for 3 minutes. Do you know how long 3 minutes is when the world is ending? It's an eternity. You have time to think about every regret, every mistake, every person you didn't call. I thought about Sarah. I thought about the divorce papers sitting on the kitchen counter in the apartment I vacated. I thought about how stupid it was to die in a glass box in the sky. And then I saw the mountain across the valley, Red Peak. Through the vibrating glass, I watched the entire north face of Red Peak shear off. Millions of tons of granite and soil just let go. It slid down the mountain like a blanket sliding off a bed. The landslide hit the valley floor with such force that I saw the dust wave rise before the sound even reached me. When the sound of the landslide hit, it drowned out the screeching of my own tower. A roar like a jet engine directly in my ear. And then, as abruptly as it started, the violence stopped. The tower swung a few more times, momentum dying out, groaning, settling. I lay there under the table, breathing in short, sharp gasps. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt. Silence returned. But it wasn't the peaceful silence of the morning. It was a heavy, shocked silence. The birds were gone. The wind had died. I waited. 1 minute. 2. Slowly, shaking, I crawled out from under the table. My hip was throbbing. I had a cut on my hand from the broken coffee mug. I stood up and grabbed the edge of the table for balance. The floor was tilted. The whole tower was listing about 5 degrees to the south. One of the footings must have cracked or shifted. I looked out the windows. The landscape had changed. The road down to the trailhead was gone, buried under a rockfall. The topography of the valley looked wrong, twisted, like a crumpled piece of paper. I scrambled for the radio. The handset was dangling by its cord. I snatched it up. Dispatch. Sandy. This is Blackwood. Do you copy? Mayday, Mayday. We just had a massive quake up here. Tower is damaged, but standing. Over. Static. Pure, white noise. Sandy. Anyone? This is Elias at Blackwood Ridge. Is anyone receiving? Nothing. Not even the squelch of a carrier wave. The repeater towers on the lower peaks were probably down. Or the power grid was gone. I dropped the handset and ran to the door. I needed to check the structural integrity. I unlocked the heavy steel door and pushed. It jammed. The frame was torqued. I had to throw my shoulder into it, once, twice, before it popped open with a screech of metal on metal. I stepped out onto the catwalk. The cold air hit me. It smelled of pulverized rock and pine sap. I gripped the railing, which was bent, and looked down the ladder. The stairs were still there, thank God. The legs looked twisted, and one of the concrete footings was cracked wide open, but the structure was holding. For now. But that wasn't what stopped my heart. It was what was happening down in the valley. Specifically, at the base of the landslide on Red Peak, where the earth had split open, a jagged canyon that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. Something was venting. It looked like steam at first. High-pressure jets of white gas shooting hundreds of feet into the air. But it wasn't dissipating. It was heavy. It was pouring out of the fissure and rolling down the slope like water. It was a fog bank, but unnatural. Thick. Opaque. Creamy white with veins of yellow. I grabbed my binoculars from the floor of the cab and raised them. My hands were shaking so bad I had to rest my elbows on the railing to steady the view. I focused on the fissure. The gas was pouring out, filling the lowest points of the valley first. It was moving fast. Faster than fog should move. It was flowing over the trees, and where it touched the pines, the green needles seemed to turn grey instantly. Maybe it was just the lighting, but it looked like the forest was dying on contact. And then I saw the movement. At the edge of the fissure, right where the gas was thickest, something crawled out. At this distance, maybe 4 miles, it was just a speck, a dark, jagged silhouette against the white mist. But I saw it move. It didn't walk like a deer or a bear. It moved, jerkily, twitchy. It scuttled out of the hole and stopped. Then another one. Then 3 more. They were swarming out of the earth like ants from a kicked hill. They moved into the mist and vanished. I lowered the binoculars. The hair on my arms was standing up. I looked at the altimeter again. The mist was pooling in the basin. The valley floor is at about 2,000 feet. The mist was already rising. I was safe up here. I was high up. But the road was gone. The radio was dead. And the earth was bleeding something terrible into the sky. I went back inside the cab and locked the door. I grabbed a roll of duct tape from the utility drawer and taped over the crack in the north window. It felt pathetic, like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. I sat in the chair, watching the white ocean rise. That was day 1, the day the silence broke. By 2 p.m., The adrenaline crash hit me. I sat on the floor, shivering, unable to get warm. I ate a protein bar without tasting it. It tasted like sawdust. I forced myself to get up. I needed to know where I stood. I needed to be logical. If I panicked, I was dead. That's what the training says. Panic is the killer. Assess. Plan. Act. I grabbed a notebook and a pen. I started cataloging. Water. The cistern holds 500 gallons. It's gravity-fed from the roof collection system. I checked the gauge. It was full. But the pipe running from the roof was bent. If it rains, I might not catch much. Still, 500 gallons is a lot for one man. Water wasn't the problem. Food. That was the problem. I was nearing the end of my rotation. The supply truck was due in 3 days. I opened the pantry. 6 cans of chili. 4 cans of peaches. A half bag of rice, maybe 2 pounds. A jar of peanut butter, mostly empty. A box of crackers, stale. 3 freeze-dried backpacker meals. Coffee, plenty, thank God. That was it. Maybe 10 days of food if I stretched it. 2 weeks if I starved myself. Fuel. The propane tank for the stove and the heater is a 100-pound cylinder at the base of the tower, piped up. I checked the pressure gauge inside the cab. It read 40%. Enough for heat, if I was careful. Weapons. I'm a fire lookout, not a soldier. We aren't issued guns. But this is the Pacific Northwest, and there are cougars and meth heads in the woods. I had my personal piece. A .357 Magnum revolver. Ruger GP 100. It was in my lockbox under the cot. I unlocked the box. The gun was heavy, cold steel. I checked the cylinder. 6 rounds. I dug through my duffel bag for the extra box of ammo. 1 box. 50 rounds. Plus the 6 in the gun. 56 bullets. I also had a flare gun with 3 flares. A hatchet. A K-bar knife. I laid it all out on the Osborne fire finder table. It looked pathetic against the backdrop of the apocalypse outside. By 4 p.m., the mist had swallowed the foothills. It was rising faster than I thought. It wasn't just filling the valley. It was expanding. I tried the radio again. Mayday, Mayday. Any station. This is Blackwood. Static. I switched to the AM/FM receiver, my personal battery-operated radio I used for music. I scanned the dial. Start at 88.0. Scan up. Static. 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 92.5. A burst of noise. Not voice. Just a harsh, rhythmic clicking sound. Click, 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 hiss. I tuned past it. 101.1. Faint music? No, just a ghost signal. I went all the way to the top of the dial. Nothing. The entire spectrum was washed out. Or maybe there was just nobody broadcasting. I went out to the catwalk as the sun began to set. The sunset was wrong. Usually, the light hits the mountains and turns them purple and gold. Tonight, the sun was reflecting off the top of the mist layer. It turned the world blood red. The mist was now at 3,000 feet. It had risen 1,000 feet in 6 hours. I grabbed the binoculars again. The light was fading, but I could still see the edge of the cloud where it met the tree line on the slope below me. The trees were vanishing into the white. And then I heard it. It wasn't the wind. The air was dead calm. It was a sound coming from inside the mist. It sounded like chattering, like 1,000 people teeth chattering in the cold all at once. A dry, clicking, skittering sound. It echoed off the canyon walls. Tick, 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 scree. I leaned over the railing, straining to hear. Down below, right at the edge of the mist line, a deer burst out of the fog. A buck. Big one. It was sprinting uphill, scrambling over the scree, eyes wide, foaming at the mouth. It was terrified. It cleared the fog by maybe 20 yards. It stopped, looking back, heaving. Then the mist surged. It didn't drift. It lunged, like a wave crashing on a beach. A tendril of white gas shot up the slope and enveloped the deer's hind legs. The buck screamed. I've never heard a deer make a sound like that. It wasn't a bleat. It was a shriek. And then shapes materialized out of the fog. They were fast. Too fast to track clearly. They looked like oversized crabs. No, spiders. They were pale, the color of bone, with long, multi-jointed limbs. They swarmed the buck. There was a flurry of motion, the sound of wet tearing. The scream cut off instantly. The shapes dragged the carcass back down into the white. In 10 seconds, the slope was empty again. Just the mist, swirling innocently. I backed away from the railing. I backed all the way into the cab and slammed the steel door. I threw the deadbolt. I dragged the heavy lockbox in front of the door. I sat in the dark, clutching the .357. The altimeter read 6,400 feet. The mist was at 3,000 feet. I had elevation. I had distance. But I knew, with a sinking, cold certainty in my gut, that the water level was rising, and I was trapped on the highest rock in a drowning world. Night fell like a hammer. Up here, darkness is usually a comfort. You get the stars. So many stars they look like spilled sugar on black velvet. You get the moon turning the glaciers on Rainier into glowing blue ghosts. But that night there were no stars. The dust from the landslide had risen into the upper atmosphere, choking out the sky. It was pitch black. Absolute, suffocating heavy darkness. I didn't turn on the lantern. That was instinct. I didn't know the rules yet, but my gut told me, do not become a beacon. I sat on the floor with my back against the Osborne firefinder, wrapped in a wool blanket. The temperature had dropped to 20 degrees. The glass box of the cab, which was a greenhouse during the day, was a refrigerator at night. I listened. The silence of the mountain was gone. In its place was a soundscape from hell. It started around 9 p.m. A low, rhythmic thrumming rising from the valley floor. It sounded like a massive hive, amplified by the canyon walls. Click hiss, click hiss. Millions of legs moving over stone. Millions of mandibles snapping. Every now and then, a scream would punch through the drone. An elk, maybe, or a coyote. Short, sharp, and cut off instantly. I held the Ruger .357 in my lap. The metal was so cold it burned my fingers. I kept running the scenario in my head. They can't climb the tower. It's 60 feet of steel lattice. The stairs are steep. They're bugs, right? Or crabs. Can crabs climb steel? I didn't sleep. I dozed in 5-minute bursts, waking up with my heart hammering every time the wind rattled the loose pane in the north window. Sometime around 3 a.m., the tower groaned, a deep metallic moan that vibrated through my spine. The footing that had cracked during the quake shifted again. The whole cab lurched an inch to the left. I froze. I stopped breathing. Down below, the chattering swelled. It got louder, angry. They heard it. They heard the metal groan 4,000 feet above them. I pressed my hand over my mouth to stifle a cough I didn't even have. I lay there, rigid, waiting for the sound of claws on the stairs, waiting for the scratching at the trapdoor. But the wind picked up, whistling through the lattice, masking the sound of the tower. The chattering below slowly subsided back into that dull, rhythmic drone. I realized then, sound was the enemy. Sound was the dinner bell. Day 2. Wednesday, October 15th. I woke up because the light was hurting my eyes. I uncurled from the floor, stiff, my hip aching where I'd bruised it. I stood up slowly, keeping my head low, and looked out. I gasped. The world was gone. Yesterday, the mist had been a river in the valley floor. Today, it was an ocean. I checked the altimeter immediately. Altitude, 6,400 feet. Estimated mist level, 4,200 feet. It had risen over 1,000 feet in the night. It had swallowed the foothills. It had swallowed the lower logging roads. It was lapping at the base of the mid-range peaks like white water. The sun was up, but it wasn't the sun I knew. It was filtered through the haze, a pale, sickly yellow disk. The light reflected off the top of the mist layer, creating a blinding glare. It was like looking at a snowfield, but moving. The mist wasn't still. It churned. It roiled. It looked heavy, viscous. I needed to see. I needed intel. I crawled to the equipment locker and pulled out the spotting scope. It's a high-end vortex scope on a tripod, usually used for spotting smoke wisps across 3 counties. I set it up low, keeping the tripod legs retracted so I could use it while sitting on the floor. I aimed it down at the new shoreline. At 4,200 feet, there's a rocky outcrop called the Pulpit. It's a popular hiking spot, a sheer cliff face jutting out of the timber. I focused the lens. The image blurred, then sharpened. The Pulpit was an island now. The mist was swirling around its base. And the rock face. The rock face was moving. "Oh God," I whispered. It wasn't rock. It was them. Through the scope, I got my first clear look at the enemy. They weren't spiders. They looked like isopods, those little roly-poly bugs you find under rocks in the garden, but magnified by a nightmare. They were about the size of a large dog, maybe bigger. Pale, translucent exoskeleton that looked wet. They had too many legs to count, short and hooked, designed for gripping. But it was the heads that made me gag. No eyes. Just a smooth, armored dome. And below it, a mass of sensory feelers, whipping the air frantically, tasting for vibration. There were hundreds of them clustered on the rock face. They were clinging to the granite, perfectly still, basking in the weak sunlight. As I watched, a rock, maybe the size of a fist, dislodged from somewhere higher up the cliff. It bounced down the face. Clack, clack. The reaction was instantaneous. The entire colony rippled. It was like a wave of water. 50 of them detached from the wall and swarmed the spot where the rock had hit. They moved with terrifying speed, flowing over each other, mandibles snapping at the empty stone. They attacked the sound. When they realized it was nothing, they stopped. They went rigid again, waiting. I pulled my eye away from the scope. My sweat was cold on my forehead. They are blind. They are sound-sensitive. And they are hungry. I looked at the tower legs. Steel lattice. If I dropped a wrench, if I slammed a door, if the tower groaned again, I needed to secure the cab. I needed to make this glass box a tomb of silence. The next 6 hours were the most excruciating work of my life. I needed to reinforce the cracked north window. The duct tape was holding, but the wind was picking up. If that pane blew out, the noise would be like a cannon shot, and it would let the smell of me out into the wind. I had plywood in the maintenance shed at the base of the tower, but going down there was impossible. I couldn't risk the stairs. The metal grating clangs when you walk on it, no matter how soft you tread. I had to use what was in the cab. I looked at the interior, the cot, the shelves, the Osborne fire finder table. I decided on the shelves. They were pine, 1x10 planks, screwed into the wall studs. I took the screwdriver from the drawer. Every turn of the screw was a calculated risk. Scree-ch. I stopped. I waited. I checked the scope. The colony on the pulpit hadn't moved. I turned the screw again. Scree-ch. It took me an hour to remove one shelf. 4 screws. My hands were cramping from the tension. I took the plank. It wasn't big enough to cover the whole window, just the crack. I didn't have a drill to make pilot holes. I couldn't hammer nails. The noise would be suicide. I had to use the adhesive. A tube of heavy-duty construction adhesive I'd used to patch a leak in the roof last season. I squeezed the thick, grey goop onto the glass around the crack. My hand was trembling. If the glass shattered while I pressed the board against it, I pressed the wood onto the glass. Gently. Push. Hold. I held it there for 20 minutes. My arms burned. I counted the seconds. 1 Mississippi. 2 Mississippi. When I finally let go, the board stuck. I slumped back against the wall, exhausted. It was a patch job. Ugly. But it would stop the vibration. I looked at the inventory again. Water, 500 gallons. Food, dwindling. I ate half a can of peaches for lunch. I drank the syrup. I licked the tin. Sanitation. This was a problem I hadn't thought about. The toilet is an outhouse at the base of the tower. I couldn't go down there. I looked at the empty peach can. Well, I whispered to myself, that's dignity gone. I spent the afternoon watching the mist. It was still rising, inch by inch. I did the math. Yesterday, 3,000 feet. Today, 4,200 feet. Rate of rise, roughly 50 feet per hour. My elevation, 6,400 feet. Distance remaining, 2,200 feet. If the rate held steady, the mist, and the things swimming in it, would reach the floor of the lookout in 44 hours. Friday morning. I had until Friday morning before I was underwater. Night 2. The darkness came back, and with it, the cold. I had wrapped myself in every blanket I owned. I was wearing 2 pairs of socks, long johns, my uniform pants, my flannel, and my heavy parka. The silence in the cab was absolute. I had taped down everything that could rattle. I had put wool socks over the legs of the chair. I sat by the west window, looking out into the void. The sounds from below were louder tonight. The drone was closer. I could hear individual clicks now, distinct from the mass. They were moving up the slopes, following the mist line, hunting the fleeing wildlife. I stared at the blackness where the horizon should be, and then I saw it. A light. It was faint, flickering, to the south, maybe 5 miles away. I grabbed the binoculars. It was on Peaks. Wait, I knew that profile. That was Grizzly Peak. Elevation 5,800 feet. Lower than me, but still high. There was a private cabin up there. An A-frame built by some tech millionaire from Seattle who wanted to play mountain man. The light was Morse code. Short, short, short. Long, 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 short. Short, short. SOS. Someone was alive. I felt a surge of emotion that almost choked me. I wasn't the last one. I grabbed my flashlight. A heavy maglite LED. I raised it to the window. My thumb hovered over the switch. I should signal back. I should let them know I see them. I pressed the button. I flashed it 3 times. Flash, flash, flash. The light on Grizzly Peak stopped blinking. Then it flashed back. Rapidly, frantically. Hello, hello, hello. I watched the light. It was a strong beam, probably a tactical light. It was cutting through the dark, swinging back and forth. And then I remembered the deer. I remembered the rock on the cliff. They react to vibration. But do they react to light? Can they see? The scope showed no eyes. Just armor. But maybe they sense heat. Or maybe. I watched through the binoculars. The light on Grizzly Peak was still flashing. Then I saw something else. Below the light, in the darkness of the slope, the mist was glowing. It was a faint, bioluminescent pulse. A ripple of blue-green light moving through the white fog. It was surging uphill toward the cabin. "Turn it off," I whispered. "Turn it off, you idiot." The light kept flashing. SOS. The blue ripple moved faster. It wasn't one thing. It was thousands of them. The friction of their bodies, or maybe some chemical reaction, was creating static or light. It looked like a phosphorescent wave crashing up the mountain. They were swarming the light. Maybe they could sense the electromagnetic hum of the battery. Maybe the guy was shouting. I watched the beam of the flashlight on Grizzly Peak jerk wildly. It swung up to the trees, then down to the ground. Then I saw the muzzle flashes. Pop, 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 pop. Tiny sparks in the distance. He was shooting. The blue wave crested the ridge. It swallowed the cabin. The flashlight beam spun in a crazy arc, illuminating the mist for a split second. In that flash, I saw them. A wall of pale bodies. A tsunami of legs. Then the light went out. The muzzle flashes stopped. I waited. I watched for an hour. The light never came back. The blue glow faded back into the white soup. I slowly lowered the binoculars. My hands were numb. I looked at my own flashlight sitting on the windowsill. I slowly, carefully, unscrewed the tail cap and took the batteries out. I wasn't going to signal anyone again. I was alone. And I intended to stay that way. Day 3. Thursday, October 16th. I didn't sleep after watching the lights go out on Grizzly Peak. I just sat there, watching the digital numbers on my watch flip. 3 a.m., 4 a.m., 5 a.m. When the sun finally dragged itself up, the light was worse than yesterday. The sky wasn't blue anymore. It was a bruised purple, choked by particulate matter from the landslides and whatever gas was venting from the earth. I checked the altimeter. Altitude, 6,400 feet. Estimated mist level, 5,100 feet. It was slowing down. Just a fraction. Yesterday it was rising at 50 feet an hour. Now, maybe 40. But the math didn't change the outcome. It just bought me a few extra hours of dread. I looked down. The mist wasn't a distant ocean anymore. It was a lake filling the bowl beneath me. I could see the tops of the Douglas firs poking out of the white surface like drowning hands. And then I watched them disappear. I saw a tree, a massive 100-foot fir, shudder. The mist swallowed the lower branches. Then the middle. Then the top. And then the tree just leaned. It fell slowly, silently into the fog. The soil was liquefying. The gas wasn't just suffocating the air. It was destabilizing the ground. I realized then that my plan to wait it out was suicide. If the mist reached the top of the ridge, two things would happen. 1. The tower's footings, anchored in granite, might hold, but the soil around them would turn to soup. The tower could tip. 2. The air. I walked to the door and cracked it open. I took a shallow breath. The metallic taste was gone. Now, it smelled like rotten eggs and ammonia, sulfur and something organic, like a compost pile that had caught fire. If the mist enveloped the cab, I wouldn't be eaten. I would suffocate. The gas was heavier than air, displacing the oxygen. I'd fall asleep and never wake up. Then the chitins would come up the stairs and pick the meat off my bones. I needed to seal the cab. Hermetically. I looked at the window I'd patched with the shelf. It was crude. Air was still leaking through the grain of the wood. I needed plastic. Heavy-duty sheeting. I needed duct tape, more than the half-roll I had. I needed silicone cork. I needed the respirator mask kept in the wildland firefighting kit. And I knew exactly where all that stuff was. It was in the supply shed, at the bottom of the tower. I looked through the floor grate. 60 feet down. The ground was still clear. The mist was 1,300 feet below that. But were they? The swarm on the pulpit had reacted to sound. But do they scout? Do solitary hunters range ahead of the main cloud? I had to go down. I had to go down, or I was going to die in this glass box. I prepared like I was going to war. I put on my heavy boots, lacing them tight. Loose laces trip you. Tripping makes noise. Noise kills. I put on my leather work gloves. I took the Ruger .357 and put it in the holster on my belt. I hoped to God I wouldn't have to use it. A gunshot would echo for miles. It would be a beacon. I took the hatchet. A solid piece of steel with a hickory handle. Silent. Deadly close-up. I stood at the trapdoor in the floor. My hand hovered over the latch. "Breathe," I whispered. "Just breathe." I lifted the hatch. The hinges squeaked. I froze, wincing. I waited 10 seconds. Nothing but the wind. I stepped onto the ladder. The descent was a nightmare of sensory overload. The wind was whipping around the lattice legs of the tower. Every time I put a boot on a step, I felt the vibration travel through the steel. Clang, clang. It felt deafening to me, even though I was moving as soft as a ghost. I kept my eyes on the tree line surrounding the clearing. The lookout is perched on a bald granite peak, but the trees start about 50 yards down the slope. Dark, dense. I counted the steps. 40, 30, 20. I reached the bottom landing. My boots touched the granite. It felt wrong to be on the ground. I felt heavy, exposed. Up in the tower, I was an eagle. Down here, I was a mouse. The shed was 20 feet away. A small, corrugated metal shack bolted to the rock. I moved toward it, placing my feet carefully. Heel to toe. Roll the weight. I reached the shed door. It was padlocked. Damn it. I had the key on the ring on my belt. I fumbled for it, the keys jingling. I grabbed them instantly to silence the noise. I found the small brass key. I slid it into the padlock. Click. I turned it. The shackle popped open. I pulled the lock off and set it gently on the ground. I opened the door. The shed smelled of gasoline, old canvas, and rat poison. To me, it smelled like hope. I stepped inside and pulled the door almost shut behind me, leaving a crack for light. I scanned the shelves. Yes, 3 rolls of heavy-duty duct tape. A box of 6mm plastic sheeting, painter's drop cloth. A tube of silicone sealant in a caulking gun. The emergency medical kit, red bag. And there, on the hook, the Wildland fire respirator. It wasn't a full scuba tank, just a heavy-duty filter mask for smoke and particulates. It wouldn't filter out everything, but it would buy me time. I grabbed a canvas tote bag from the floor and started loading it. Gently. Plastic sheeting. In. Tape. In. Cork. In. Mask. In. I saw a box of road flares. I grabbed 2. I saw a crowbar. I hesitated. It was heavy, but it was a weapon. I slid it into my belt loop. I was turning to leave when I heard it. Click. It came from right outside the shed. I froze. My hand was halfway to the door handle. Sniff. Huff. Click, click, click. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of something hard tapping against the granite. I stopped breathing. I mean that literally. I held the air in my lungs and clamped my jaw shut. Through the crack in the door, maybe an inch wide, I saw movement. A leg. It was pale, the color of a maggot. It had 3 joints and ended in a hooked spike. It stepped into my field of view, silent and precise. Then the body followed. It was a scout, smaller than the ones I saw on the cliff, maybe the size of a wolf. Its exoskeleton was mottled gray and white, blending in with the granite. It moved with a twitchy, fluid grace. It had no eyes, just that smooth, armored dome. It paused right in front of the shed door. I could see the sensory feelers on its face twitching. They were waving in the air, picking up molecules. It smelled me. Or maybe it smelled the fresh grease on the padlock I'd just opened. It turned its head. The dome faced the door. It stepped closer. I gripped the handle of the hatchet. My knuckles were white. The distance between us was less than 2 feet. Just a thin sheet of corrugated metal separated my face from those mandibles. The creature reached out with one of its front limbs. It tapped the metal door. Ting. The sound was tiny, but the creature recoiled, hissing softly. It didn't like the sound of the metal. It leaned in again. It pressed its face against the crack. I was looking directly at its mouth parts. A wet, palpitating mass of muscle and chitin. I could smell it now, acrid like burning hair. If I moved, my joints would pop. If I exhaled, it would feel the air current. I stared at the blank face of the monster, and I prayed. I'm not a religious man, but I prayed to the mountain, to the steel, to anything that would listen. Go away. Please, just go away. The creature hissed again. It dragged a claw down the metal. Scree! I didn't flinch. I died inside, but my body didn't flinch. It stayed there for an eternity. Maybe 2 minutes. Just tasting the air. Then, from the tower above, the wind caught a loose cable. Thwack. The sound echoed from 60 feet up. The creature's head snapped up. Its feelers vibrated. It spun around, focusing on the tower legs. It lost interest in the shed. It wanted the noise. It scurried away from the door, moving toward the tower footing. It circled the concrete base, tapping it, investigating. It was my chance. I waited until it was on the far side of the footing. I pushed the door open. Silent. I stepped out. I sprinted for the ladder. I didn't care about silence anymore. I needed speed. I hit the first rung. My boot clanged. The creature shrieked. A high-pitched, piercing whistle. I scrambled up. Hand over hand. Feet slipping on the rungs. I looked down. The chitin was at the base of the ladder. It reared up, slamming its front legs against the steel. It tried to grip the first rung. I saw it struggle. Its hooked claws were designed for rock and earth, not smooth, cold steel. It slipped. It fell back. It shrieked again, louder, calling for backup. I didn't stop. I hauled myself up the last 20 feet, threw the tote bag onto the catwalk, and rolled through the gate. I slammed the steel trapdoor shut and spun the locking wheel. I collapsed on the floor of the cab, gasping for air, clutching the hatchet. I crawled to the window and looked down. The Scout was still there. It was pacing around the bottom of the ladder, looking up with its eyeless face. And then, from the tree line, I saw them. 3 more. Then 5. Then 10. They came pouring out of the woods, answering the call. They swarmed the base of the tower. They climbed over the shed. They tested the legs. They couldn't climb the steel. Not easily. But now they knew I was here. The dinner bell had rung. I spent the rest of day 3 turning the cab into a bubble. I knew they were down there. I could hear them scratching at the granite, testing the footings. The drone was constant now. But I had a bigger problem coming. The mist. By 4 p.m., the white wall was at 5,800 feet. It was rushing up the final slope. The air outside was turning yellow. I worked methodically. Panic was gone. This was just engineering now. I took the plastic sheeting and cut it into strips. I taped over every seam of the windows. I used the silicone caulk to seal the floorboards where the wood met the walls. I sealed the door frame. I sealed the trapdoor from the inside, using an entire tube of caulk and layer after layer of duct tape. I was building a terrarium. I checked the vents, the roof vents and the floor vents used for air circulation. I stuffed them with rags and taped them shut. I was sealing myself in, which meant I was limiting my air supply. The cab is 14 by 14 feet, with an 8-foot ceiling. That's roughly 1,500 cubic feet of air. A human breathes about 20 cubic feet of air a day? No, that sounds low. I tried to remember the diving tables. Regardless, I had days of air in here. But eventually, the CO2 would build up. I'd have to burp the room, open a seal, let air in. But if the air outside was toxic, I looked at the respirator mask. I tested the fit. It was tight. At 6:30 p.m., the sun disappeared. Not because it set, but because the mist overtook the tower. It didn't crash over me like a wave. It rose up silently. 1 minute, I could see the tops of the trees. The next, wisps of white vapor were curling over the railing of the catwalk. Then, the windows went white. It was instant claustrophobia. The world shrank to 14 feet. I stood in the center of the room. The silence changed. The wind noise was gone, dampened by the fog. But the other sounds, they were amplified. Scrape, click, hiss. They were all around me now. The swarm wasn't just on the ground. They were on the rocks immediately below the tower. And then I heard a sound that stopped my heart. Thump. Something hit the roof. I looked up at the ceiling. Scrape. Scrape. It sounded like heavy hail dragging across the shingles. They can climb wood. The tower legs are steel. But the roof has wooden eaves. And if the mist was high enough, I realized with horror that the mist might be buoyant. Or maybe the ones on the roof had dropped from. Where? There was nothing above me but sky. No, they were climbing the guy wires. The tension cables that held the tower steady against the wind. The cables were steel, but they were twisted, textured. Like a rope. Scrape. There was one on the roof. Right above my head. I slowly pulled the Ruger from my holster. I pointed it at the ceiling. I stood there in the white, silent box, waiting for the ceiling to tear open. The creature on the roof was heavy. I could track its movement by the groan of the rafters. It wasn't scuttling like the ones on the ground. It was testing. Step. Creak. Pause. Step. Creak. I stood in the center of the room, my head tilted back, the revolver raised. The plastic sheeting I'd taped over the windows was pulsing gently in and out, like the room was breathing. The air inside was getting stale, warm, and thick with the smell of unwashed fear. The scraping stopped directly above the stovepipe. The wood stove is in the corner. The metal pipe goes straight up, punches through the ceiling, and has a conical rain cap on the roof. It's 6 inches of galvanized steel. Clang. The creature hit the rain cap. Clang screech. It was tearing it off. I looked at the stove. The door was latched, but the seals were old. If that thing ripped the pipe out, 2 things would happen. The gas would pour in like water through a funnel, and the creature would have a doorway. I holstered the gun and grabbed the duct tape. I scrambled to the stove. Screech, crunch. Above me, the metal pipe jerked upward. A shower of soot and rust fell into the firebox. The creature was pulling the chimney out of the roof. I grabbed the roll of plastic sheeting. I tore off a massive square. I wadded it up into a ball the size of a basketball. I opened the stove door. The draft hit me, cold, sulfurous air rushing down the pipe. The cap was gone. The pipe was open to the sky. I shoved the plastic ball into the firebox, jamming it up into the flue. Thump. Something hit the plastic from above. The creature was reaching down the pipe. I heard the click-click hiss of its mandibles echoing inside the metal tube. It was right there, inches away. I slammed the iron door of the stove and spun the handle to lock it. Then I grabbed the duct tape. I taped the door shut. I taped the seams where the pipe met the stove. I taped the damper handle. I backed away, panting. The pipe rattled violently. The creature was frustrated. It banged on the roof again. Thump, thump, then silence. I waited. 1 minute. 2. Had it given up? Then I heard a new sound. A stripping sound. Like Velcro being torn apart slowly. It was moving to the edge of the roof. To the eaves. I looked at the plastic sheeting over the north window, the one with the cracked glass. A shadow appeared behind the plastic. A long, distorted silhouette pressed against the layers of polyethylene. It tapped on the glass. Tink. Then it punched. The glass didn't shatter. The safety laminate held it together, but it spiderwebbed with a sickening crack. The creature hit it again. Harder. The wood shelf I'd glued over the crack popped off. The plastic sheeting bulged inward. I grabbed the respirator mask. I pulled the straps over my head, tightening them until the rubber bit into my skin. I took a breath. The air tasted like charcoal and rubber. Crash! The creature drove its armored head through the window. The plastic sheeting tore. The mist poured in instantly. It was like a pressurized jet. Thick, yellow-white fog violently displacing the air in the room. The creature tried to squeeze through. The frame was too small for its body, but it was thrashing, breaking the wood, widening the hole. I saw its face clearly now. The eyeless, pale dome. The mouthparts dripping with a thick, clear slime. It let out a shriek that vibrated my teeth. I raised the .357. I knew what would happen. In this small, enclosed space, a magnum round would be devastating to my ears. I didn't care. I aimed for the center of the open mouth. Boom! The flash blinded me. The sound was a physical blow, a sledgehammer to the side of the head. My hearing instantly cut out, replaced by a high-pitched ringing whine. The creature jerked back. A spray of black ichor coated the torn plastic. It fell out of the window. I stood there, deaf, smoke curling from the barrel. Did I get it? I saw a claw hook onto the window sill. It wasn't dead. It pulled itself back up. Half its face was blown away, shattered armor hanging in strips, but it didn't seem to care. It was driven by pure, mechanical aggression. And it wasn't alone. Through the hole, in the swirling mist, I saw movement on the catwalk. 2 more shapes climbing over the railing. They had climbed the cables. I was overrun. I backed up until my legs hit the fire-finder table. I fumbled for the flare gun on the table. I dropped the revolver. My hands were shaking too bad. I grabbed the orange plastic flare gun. The first creature, the wounded one, squeezed its shoulders through the frame. It hissed, snapping at the air. I pointed the flare gun at its face and pulled the trigger. Whoosh! The magnesium flare hit the creature in the neck. It didn't just burn. It erupted. The creature shrieked. I couldn't hear it, but I felt the vibration in the floor. The intense red light of the flare illuminated the cab like a strobe light. The creature thrashed wildly, engulfed in smoke and sparks. It fell backward out the window, taking the flare with it. I saw the light tumbling down into the mist below. But the reaction. The other 2 creatures on the catwalk recoiled. They didn't attack. They scrambled away from the light. They hated it. They scrambled over the railing and dropped out of sight. Light. They aren't just sensitive to sound. They are photophobic. Extreme light hurts them. I grabbed the box of road flares. I cracked one. The striker hissed, and the cab was bathed in brilliant, sputtering red light. I ran to the broken window. I threw the flare out onto the catwalk. I cracked another one. I threw it on the roof, tossing it out the window and hoping it landed up there. I cracked a third one and held it in my left hand like a torch. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by swirling mist, holding the red flame. Nothing came back. I couldn't repair the window. The hole was too big, and the plastic was shredded. The mist filled the room. I sat in the corner, wearing the respirator, clutching the flare in one hand and the hatchet in the other. The silence was gone. My hearing was slowly coming back, but it was muffled, like I was underwater. The temperature dropped. The mist was freezing. Condensation formed on everything. The table, the glass, my skin. I had to change the flare every 20 minutes. Crack. Hiss. Burn. I had 12 flares. 4 hours of light. I rationed them. I waited until the shadows moved, until I heard the scritch-scratch on the walls, and then I'd light one. The red glare would send them scurrying back down the lattice. I learned their rhythm. They were probing, testing the defenses. But the light held them at bay. Sometime around 3 a.m., I ran out of flares. I sat in the dark. The mist was so thick I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I held the hatchet. Come on, I thought. Come and get it. But they didn't come. Maybe the fire had scared them enough. Maybe they found easier prey down in the valley. Or maybe they were just waiting for me to fall asleep. I didn't sleep. I hallucinated. I saw faces in the fog. I saw my ex-wife, Sarah, standing by the fire-finder, looking disappointed. I saw the deer from the mountain, its eyes white and dead. I checked my watch. 5:30 a.m. The battery in my watch died. The display just faded out. Time was gone. Dawn broke, but I only knew it because the grey soup in the room turned a slightly lighter shade of grey. I was alive. I stood up. My legs were numb. The respirator filter was clogging. It was hard to draw breath. I walked to the broken window. The mist was still there, but it was lower. I blinked. I wiped the condensation off my mask. The top of the railing was visible. The mist had receded maybe 2 feet. I looked up. The sky was still choked with dust, but there was a patch of blue. A tiny, beautiful patch of blue directly overhead. The gas was heavy. It settled at night, maybe? Or the venting was slowing down. I didn't care why. I just knew I had a window. I couldn't stay here. The tower was compromised. The food was gone. The water was contaminated. The flares were gone. If I stayed another night, I was dead. I had to move. I looked at the map on the fire finder table. It was damp and curling at the edges. Grizzly Peak. The guy with the flashlight. He stopped signaling. But maybe the cabin was still there. Maybe he had supplies. Maybe he had a radio that worked. It was 5 miles. Through the woods. Across the ridge line. If I stayed on the ridge, the spine of the range, I could stay above 6,000 feet for most of the trek. There was a saddle between the peaks that dipped to 5,500. That would be the kill zone. I packed the bag. Water bottle. Hatchet. Revolver. Reloaded. The last roll of duct tape. A compass. I took the mask off for a second to drink water. The air smelled of sulfur, but it was breathable. Barely. I put the mask back on. I stepped out onto the catwalk. The destruction was absolute. The metal grating was scarred by claws. The roof was missing shingles. The carcass of the creature I'd shot with the flare was gone, dragged away by its kin. I looked down the ladder. The mist swirled around the base of the tower. I couldn't see the ground. I had to climb down into it. 1 step, I said. My voice sounded hollow in the mask. I swung my leg over the ladder. I began the descent. When my boots hit the granite at the bottom, I crouched instantly, hatchet raised. Visibility was 10 feet. The ground was covered in a slime trail. It glistened on the rocks. I moved away from the tower, heading south, toward the ridge line. The woods were silent. No birds. No wind. Just the dripping of the mist off the pine needles. I walked for an hour. Every shadow looked like a monster. Every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot. I found the trail. It was a faint deer track running along the spine of the ridge. I followed it, and then I stopped. In the middle of the trail there was a boot print, a vibram sole. fresh. It was pointing toward Blackwood Ridge, toward my tower. Someone had walked this way recently. After the rain of dust, I knelt down. Beside the boot print, there was something scratched into the dirt. An arrow, pointing back the way I came. And a word. Below. I stared at it. Below. What was below? The mist. The creatures? Or was it a warning? Or an invitation? I looked back toward the tower. It was invisible in the fog. I looked forward toward Grizzly Peak. I stood up. I gripped the hatchet. I didn't know what below meant, but I was going to find out, because the only way out of this hell was through it. I took a step, and then, from the fog ahead of me, a voice spoke. It wasn't a shout. It was a whisper, amplified by a speaker. "Drop the weapon, Elias." I froze. A figure emerged from the white. A silhouette in a full hazmat suit, yellow and bulky. They were holding a rifle, and they were pointing it at my chest. "Welcome to the ground floor," the voice said. I stared at the figure. I stared at the rifle. The world had ended. The monsters had risen. And here was a man in a yellow suit who knew my name. I didn't drop the hatchet. "Who are you?" I asked. The figure didn't answer. He just racked the slide of the rifle. "Last chance, Elias." I tightened my grip on the hickory handle. I had survived the quake. I had survived the mist. I had survived the night in the glass box. I wasn't done surviving yet.